Okay, welcome back. This is a lecture on uh, Metacom, or also the English name King Philip's War. This is going to be taking place in what the English are starting to call New England. I'm going to share my screen here and get my PowerPoint going. Now, Metacom is the son of Usamekin, who is the main sachem that the New England colonists are dealing with. And Usamakin really helps kind of hold peace together with the Plymouth colony, with the emergent Puritans. Uh, and uh, when he dies, it kind of creates this vacuum. And then Metacom's older brother, who's going to take the place of Usamakin, he dies, and so Metacom is it takes up the challenge, and also, although it's not talked about a lot, but it's also Metacom and his brother's wife, who then ends up in a relationship with. So what we're seeing is like the political alliances among Native people is not it's about balanced gender is going on there, and so even when we say things like King Philip's War, it's like it totally has this kind of Euro-Christian idea that the sovereign is like this one royal person or this one masculine kind of figure. But when we actually look at the native context, he's not the only person in charge. And just like there are many sachems that exist throughout the region. So what we got to counter is the stock story that a lot of people in the United States are growing up with. And so this might sound familiar to you. Like the stock story says that Euro Christians tell each other is that Puritan Christians looking for religious freedom flee the yoke of King James because they want to come to the New World and set up their New Jerusalem. They make a deal with the Virginia Company made up of Anglican Christians and ruffians. They land at Cape Cod in 1620 instead of Virginia, and with the Mayflower Compact spark the first tendencies towards democratic rule and religious freedom. Yes, they get together and they're like, oh, well, since we're not in Virginia, we have to like find a way to rule among ourselves, and we're going to agree together to follow James's rule of law. And so sometimes people point back and seem like, see the natural democracy that is part of the foundations of even the colonies before the United States. That's part of the myth. Uh, they have a rough time at first, but with the help from Indians, they're able to plant crops and hold a Thanksgiving feast in 1621. Wars between native groups precede their arrival. This is part of the stock story. The Puritans, through conflict and conversions and a land sales, established, quote, New England under the charter of King James I, establishing a proxy government and establishing a settler colony. Ultimately, the Indians accept subjection by the Euro Christians, and the Euro Christians give them, quote, civilization in exchange for land. Lands not governed by a Christian prince may be and should be claimed for Christendom, whether Protestant or Catholic. Indians have, quote, no religion and need to be taught the true religion. Land sales are conducted through dealing with sachems or chiefs. In 1619, the first African slaves or African people, not always enslaved immediately, are arriving. And we have the 1619 Project, which is the recent famous book about that particular situation. So that's kind of what the Euro-Christian stock story is. And now I want to make that a little bit more complex. Counter story here. So if we look from an American Indian perspective here, um, Verrazano establishes contact with Wampanoag and Narragansetts not in the 1600s, but all the way back in 1524, remarking on the vast richness of the soil and farming. There's intimate intermittent trading that brings both disease and slaving throughout the 1500s. Um, Political conflicts develop among natives over access to European goods and vacuums of gift economy balances. The Euro-Christians have decided that native people are all brutes and savages ever from before ever departing Europe. Um, English established a Roanoke colony in 1585 and returned yearly from 1602 on with increasing brutality. The pink areas here are parts of Haudenosaunee territory at the time, or Haudenosaunee Confederacy at the time of contact, which or Algonquin speaking peoples as well. So interesting, just looking at one particular group's kind of influence of the areas. And this isn't to say that like when the French had come in, as Blackhawk talks about in his book, it's like, yeah, like there are like there is a confederacy, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and other native groups, ones that excuse me, my throat went dry there. Once they get access to European trade, that it disrupts the gift economies, and then certain groups want weapons, and that creates violence as well. And native groups are playing off of each other, unlike like any political alliances shift in the world, right? We can see it with Cortez. If we actually take a broader story, and we see that he and his men couldn't take Tenochtitlan alone. Um, so the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and this is their wampum and their flag, are dominate the gift economies in the regions that I had on the slide before. Gift economies require balance and reflect American Indian worldview fundamentally based on balance. Barbara Mann highlights that the number two in Spirits of Breath, Blood, Spirits of Breath, and her book, The Tainted Gift. Wampum was used throughout the region and is New England's currency from 1637 to 1661 and 1673 in New York. Haudenosaunee Confederacy is established. This is a later date. Sometimes people date it back to the 900s, but a lot of scholars, I'm just kind of going for a middle figure here, date it from around 1190 current era. It is the oldest democracy in the world. And yes, there is influence on the democracy that becomes the United States, and there's a part that Haudenosaunee play, but Haudenosaunee people will also say like that the people who set up the United States, they don't get it. They only got part of the story. So their democracy, yes, it is technically influenced by Native people, but it is not the same thing. So they're called the Iroquois Confederacy by the French and the League of Five Nations by the English, but the Confederacy is properly called Haudenosaunee Confederacy, meaning people of the Longhouse. The Confederacy was founded by the prophet known as the Peacemaker, with the help of Hiawatha, more commonly known as Hiawatha. The exact date of the joining of the nations is unknown and said to be from time immemorial, making it one of the first and longest lasting participatory democracies in the world. It still exists today. The Confederacy is made up of Mohawks, Oneidas, Onondagas, Cayugas, and Senecas, and was intended as a way to unite nations and create peaceful means of decision making. So we know that there was an earlier time of conflict that produced the Great Peace, right? Like, and so that we see earlier histories from before or in European contact. Um, we see that native groups will sometimes tell that there was a time of political imbalance and unrest, and there's a time of like even overthrowing elites, and we're seeing that in histories, often not just in the New England area, but perhaps like over in Cahokia. And I always want to take keep some of the narratives at arm's length, like how elite are the groups, what are the structures, what is going on culturally. It's harder to tell. It's harder to tell, but it does seem that like sometimes people leave their cities, and when they leave their cities, that maybe there was an elite kind of system of political control that gets out of hand, and then people decide, we're not going to have this anymore, and we're going to live more intentionally in this more balanced kind of system, in this much more democratic way, this much more egalitarian or collateral egalitarian way of dealing with things because they've learned, Native peoples have learned from their own past conflicts, right? Way before the Europeans get here. So each nation within the Haudenosaunee Confederacy maintains its own council with chiefs chosen by clan mothers and deals, it's a matriarchal complex and deals with its own internal affairs, but they allow a ground council to deal with issues affecting Native nations within the Confederacy. You can see that influence later on the formation of the House of Representatives versus Congress within the legislative branches of the US government. Although, yes, of course, we see the House of Commons and the House of Lords over in England as well. This is from the Haudenosaunee Confederacy's website, and you can look it up yourself. Asking the clan mothers of each tribe to present their chiefs, he placed deer antlers on each of their heads to symbolize their authority to the five nations. The Mohawks had nine chiefs of the bear, wolf, and turtle clans. The Oneida had also nine of the bear, wolf, and turtle clans. Onondaga presented 14 of the turtle, snipe, bear, hawk, deer, wolf, eel, and beaver clans. Cayuga had 10 from the heron, deer, turtle, bear, and snipe clans. And finally, Seneca presented 8 chiefs from the bear, snipe, turtle, and wolf and hawk clans. The Mohawk, Oneida, Cayuga, Seneca, and Onondaga accepted the longhouse as a symbol of their unity. In the Onondaga community, the peacemaker planted a tree, naming it the Great Tree of Peace. He directed the chiefs of the council to sit beneath the shade of it and watch the council fire. So that each of the confederacies of the nations are referred to as the fires, right? Um, Issues concerning the confederacy would be discussed and deliberated underneath the tree. So there are then later additions to the Confederacy. So after 1722, for a while, the Tuscarora joined. Lenape joined as a women colony, so the whole, or not colony, but a group of women. And so that gender balance extends to the group concepts as well. It's more than I can go into in this particular lecture, but just letting you know that it would be no sign of disrespect for a group like Lenape to identify as joining in relation to another group, to being joining as a group of women. Lenape then separate in 1753 before the French and Indian War. So we have alliances within and without the Confederacy. And then we have, this is just a map of more indigenous peoples from the Northeast. From an international perspective, this is something that we've seen from more recent scholarship. We know that there was a medieval warm period from 900 to 1300 globally, right? And we saw global temperatures rise significantly, and this affected Pueblo cultures. This affects not just Cahokia, but Chaco Canyon community from earlier lectures, probably Cahokia too. In Europe, the what happened was grain crops flourished, alpine tree lines rose, and many new cities arose, and the plantation population more than doubled. The sea levels rise, and the oceans actually get easier to navigate during this particular period. But then the Black Death comes in the 1340s, and it kills about 80%, and in some cases over 90% of Europeans, and returns intermittently. It's likely spread by both east and west by Mongolian invasions, but we know also that the plague existed 100 years before this. There's a lot more really influential stuff. I want to say her name was Monica Green. Her last name is Green because it's no relation to me, but there's a great scholar of the plague who's like in post-COVID years has come up with a lot more interesting numbers and interesting stuff about how the plague has spread, how it spreads from rats and all of that stuff. The cons are significant. Marco Polo's travels among the cons are significant for later Genoese merchants and sailors, even including Christopher Columbus. And when I read Marco Polo's his narratives or his voyages, he distinguishes Christian and non-Christian as well. So that's part of that Euro-Christian worldview. Although the siege at Kaffa, which is in current-day Crimea, was a Genoese trading port, in the early 1340s does show intentional biological warfare. It's not likely that that's how the plague spread to Europe. It's likely that it was already there and jumped to humans when flea-biting rats no longer have had hosts to jump into humans. So many people who lived flourished out after the plague. There was a cultural renaissance in combination with information obtained from invading Muslim countries and the Crusades, that creates this philosophical and artistic movement known as the Renaissance in Italy that moves up into Europe. So we want to be putting some international context into this stuff. It's a more international perspective. Spain's economy was once the richest in the world. By the late 1500s, it's crumbling. So they get all this initial silver and gold from the Andes and stuff, and then their economy is in ruins. There's also pirating going on and conflicts with the English. So the initial spoils from South America are kind of being used up. There are devastating religious wars in Europe, following the Protestant Reformation, which I've already mentioned, kills between the death tolls between 6.5 and 17.5 million during the 1500s. And then we have the 30 Years' War in the 1600s. Millions and millions of uh, of Europeans are killing each other just over Christian theological differences. The English miraculously defeat the Spanish Armada in 1588. Conflict arose over challenges to Elizabeth I's push towards Protestantism and her own Catholic sister Mary I, also known as Bloody Mary, who had tried to reverse Henry VIII's break with the papal authority. So that kind of religious conflict is shaping English politics. Then we see a return of the plague in London in the 1590s and mandatory isolation, which slows trade. So actually, people know, like, they don't know everything about how biological agents work, but they definitely know that you need to quarantine when plague breaks out or something like that. So there is a lot of knowledge of like disease going on among the Europeans before they're over here. The English spread a myth that following Bartolome de las Casas and his critiques of Columbus, they developed this idea called the Black Legend. And this is like early racism showing up, where they say like, oh, those Spanish, their economy sucks, and like they're not really good at governing people because they mix too much with Moors or Saracens or Islamic Moorish blood and also African blood. So it's not quite racial yet. It's still religious before it becomes this skin color racism. And then they say like, oh, that must have affected the Spanish, and they're just not as good at governing people as we English people who have purer white blood, right? We see the Dutch East India Company showing up in 1602, which creates significant competitions for English, French, and trading furs and spreading diseases in what's now Canada throughout the 1500s in the Great Lakes regions. In New Netherlands, we see um, this is a Dutch reprint of a map of New Netherlands, with Chesapeake Bay, and this is gonna like be what becomes New York and New Jersey, as well there, as can like up into Connecticut, Vermont kind of stuff. Uh, um, so just to let you know, like, because they depart, but the Dutch are significant during this time period, and their versions of Protestantism is important. So sometimes this war that breaks out, this called King Philip's War or Massasoit, it's like we've seen earlier massacres, like I mentioned in the last lecture, like the Mystic Falls massacre, which is a brutal massacre of over 400 Native peoples, in the 1630s. Or the Pequot War, as that's called. Um, uh, so sometimes people refer to King Philip's War as the first Indian War, but I don't. That's why I have it in quotes. I don't think that that's a really right, like correct way of talking about it. Massasoit, or also known as Usamokin, so Massasoit is a title like Great Sachem, is Wampanoag, and he deals with the English, as I said at the beginning of this lecture. He warns them against establishing missions. Um, when he dies, his first son, Wamsuta, takes over, but dies in 1662. He's married to a woman named Weetamoo, who's a female sachem. So there's that gender balance. Metacom, or King Philip, who's Opokonaket, uh, um, Wampanoag, takes over from 1662 and allies himself with Weetamoo, who's Pocasset. These are different bands within Wampanoag people. They then break with their father's alliance with the English because the English have encroached so much, taken advantage so much in the wake of Usemakin's passing, that they no longer feel like they can deal with the English. And so that then war breaks out, but then in 1671, peace with the English requires natives to give up their own guns. um, uh, War breaks out again in 1675 after the English execute three Wampanoag for murdering another Wampanoag. So it's again that the conflicts are arising over who has the right to be doing justice and governance there. So various alliances between English and natives happen in different groups, but by the end, there are 3,000 plus dead on Metacom's side. And sorry for the typo there. And another 2,000 on the English side. It is a brutal, the amount of people that are slain in that war is uh, population. When you consider the population of the area at the time, it's especially brutal. During that time period, we get some famous Mary Rawlinson's captivity narrative, which draws on European tropes. So you have these kinds of like ideas showing up in English literary or European literary sources before they show up, and so they repeat the same kinds of tropes. Um, uh, it's highly edited from a Puritan perspective as well. And my colleague Billy Stratton over at University of Denver has a book on that the shaping that he suggests that it's actually like particular Puritans who actually have their hand behind the editing and of the Mary Rawlinson narrative. So yeah, there's a lot to be said. Like if we had a more time in our class to like really dig into the whole phenomenon of captivity narratives, they happen throughout New England, but also throughout America. And they would require it like a whole semester just on captivity narratives. But I wanted to mention Billy's book here. um, what we are seeing is conflicting legal conceptions. Core ideas of English legal systems, such as corroboration for evidence, like having witnesses and lots of people testifying, and adversary procedure. This grated on Indians, right? So from a Native American perspective, like if I came up and I gave my testimony, like and then somebody else asked my another native person next to me to go and either confirm or deny my testimony, like it would already be seen as offensive to not take the first person at their word because the one's word was gold, right? So like such an undermining of one's respect, of respect for one's own being within native worldview to have this idea like, oh well, what does the amount of evidence in this case show, right? So, under the direction of Pennsylvania Judge and Counselor James Logan, English representatives investigating a 1722 murder by settlers took depositions from Indian witnesses. After one native testified, though, others steadfastly refused to discuss the same matter and wondered why they were expected to repeat what had already been said. Their norms contradicted the English practice of cross-checking accounts, obtaining a corroboration from multiple witnesses. From the same book, tribal public opinion served simultaneously as the greatest ally and the most profound constraint. Thomas Pownall, for example, when serving as lieutenant governor of New Jersey, observed how the indigenous peoples of the middle and northern colonies, quote, know no such thing as administrative or executive power, properly so called. They allow the authority of advice and as a kind of legislative authority, but there's no civil coercion. They never had one actuating power of the whole or any magistrate or magistrates as such. And what Tinker and I have argued, like, is that within indigenous worldview or American Indian worldview, it's collateral egalitarian. They don't have an up-down hierarchical image schema. And what this like book is talking about and pulling sources from the time period. This is just evidence of that, like that the concepts of an up down top down justice system, magistrates and a court system and a judge and all that stuff are completely foreign to native peoples. And so that's going to take us to the end of this particular um, lecture. So we have all sorts of conflicts breaking out, the big conflicts being in the 1670s with King Philip's War. But there's a breakdown of the initial relationships between his father, Usemakun, or Massasoit, and the English who keep encroaching on, they keep converting some, they keep creating praying towns, but the sachems are saying we won't allow missions, and then the a few natives will convert, and then the English will say like, oh well, we dealt with these natives and they gave us right to this land, and or they sold us this land, as if those native people could speak for all of the other native people in the region, right? So that becomes another source of the conflict. That's always like Christianity is being used as a tool to gain land situations that there as well. Uh, and then uh, different alliances with different native groups shifting all throughout the region, but also like what's primordially or primarily present during this era and all the way up until the American Revolution is the gift economy that's being disrupted as well. And so a lot of sources, when we talk about that legal stuff, that's awesome. That book, Justice in a New World, which it's like sitting over here behind me somewhere. That's a good book, but we actually need to put that discussion into discussion with Barbara Mann's accounts of the gift economy, because if we don't understand the maintaining of balances between gift exchange, then we don't really understand the power struggle. Because we need to then contrast that with the Euro Christians' imaginary that they have God's right and things like that to come into the land and do that sort of stuff. All of the stuff that they're doing, do that sort of stuff, that genocidal kind of stuff. Okay, I'm going to stop this lecture from there, and hopefully you should be reading and any whatever I've assigned and whatever when you're encountering this lecture. But definitely you should be contrasting this with and letting it accent the readings that I assign in class as well, right? So these lectures are supplemental to your reading. Okay, have a great day whenever, wherever you are.